Welcome to another episode of Flying High with Flutter. I'm your host, Alan Wyma. Today we have Dilion Nys on the show to talk about Celeste. Welcome, Dylan. How are you?
Hey, doing well. Thanks for having me.
And why don't you go ahead and talk a little bit about yourself and Celeste?
Yes, my name is Dylan. I spent the better part of the past 3 years working at AWS on a product called Amplify Flutter. And our goal with that really was to help bridge the gap for Flutter developers into the AWS ecosystem to build, scalable backends for their Flutter applications. During my time there, we rewrote the Amplify Flutter library. From before, it was wrapping the iOS and Android libraries, and then we rewrote it in Dart so that we could target all the Flutter platforms. And so that was a really fun experience. I learned a lot, and it really kind of set me up well to grow from there and expand into what eventually became Celeste, which is, my vision of what a backend as a service, if you will, solution would look like if you just started with Flutter as the only concern, right? So we don't support web, we don't support iOS, we don't support Android, we only support Flutter. And through that, we think we can give the best experience possible for Flutter developers.
Sorry, when you're saying you don't support iOS and web and all these things, you're saying those natively as platforms, right? But because of Flutter, you can still support those, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. What I should have said, we don't support Swift, we don't support Kotlin. We do support all the Flutter platforms, but we only do it in Dart. And so everything's written in Dart. You're not writing any other programming language ever. So everything is just defined natively in Dart the way you would expect. And then we bundle it up and deploy it for you when you're ready.
Okay. Did much of this experience and stuff come from working on Amplify? Or, I mean, it's not really using Dart on the back end, right?
So Amplify wasn't, right? So Amplify was just a wrapper on top of AWS. And so Celeste tries to abstract that even further away because part of the problem with working with a platform like AWS is that there's a lot of nuance and complexity that is specific to AWS. And then on top of that, you're just dealing with the general complexity of the cloud, infrastructure as code, and a lot of these issues. So Celeste just went from the drawing board from scratch. What can we do if we only focus on Dart, only focus on Flutter, and try to remove all of the complexity and nuance around building for the cloud?
So Celeste, right? If I heard correctly, you're saying Celeste is also similar in effect, where it kind of wraps around AWS services?
Well, currently we target Google Cloud platform, not AWS, but yeah, a lot of the experience that people might be familiar with AWS, will eventually be supported in Celeste.
Why go for Google Cloud versus AWS to begin with?
We wanted to meet Flutter people where they're at, and we felt like a lot of the time Flutter developers, when they turn to use the cloud, they're either using something like Firebase or Supabase, but if they have to go down to the raw cloud, they're typically doing it in Google from what we saw. So we just wanted to meet Flutter developers where they're at.
That makes sense. I still thought a lot of people were still on AWS no matter what. I didn't know that Flutter people were more likely on Google Cloud, but that also makes some sense considering, this is a Google product, right?
Yeah, and I think there are still a lot of people building on AWS, even if they're not building with Amplify. There's a lot of people building their backends in AWS that just happen to have a Flutter app. A lot of times, though, what we saw is if they're building specifically a Flutter app, chances are there was a higher chance they were building on Google Cloud.
Is there also any plans to kind of integrate this with Firebase? Because obviously, I think there's a ridiculous amount of people using Firebase still for their apps.
Yes. Integrates maybe not the right word, but we definitely want to provide like a streamlined, not even just migration path. Like we're not saying drop Firebase tomorrow and use this, but it's more like we want Celeste to be piecemeal where you can incrementally adopt it into your existing application. And maybe you pick and choose, parts of your application that were hard to do in Firebase and you do those in Celeste instead. And we'll have like interop between the two so that it's never one or the other.
How long has Celeste been around for?
Going on like 3.5 months now.
So it's still super early. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So the only thing you have working, according to the website that I could see over here in the docs overview, is functions, right?
Yeah, so our first focus is like serverless APIs or functions. And the roadmap is kind of after that, we'll do auth and authorization and then data and then try to fill in the blanks after that. But those are kind of our big priorities at the start.
It's a tough choice between auth and functions, right? Because I think you need kind of both nowadays because it seems like nearly every app is you need to know who that person is and have them authenticate. So what made you decide to go to functions first?
Primarily because we felt like there wasn't great support for Dart cloud functions in the major providers. So like Supabase, Firebase, it's harder to get a Dart function working in those environments, but they have pretty good authentication solutions already. So we thought that if there was one thing that we felt like was sorely missing currently, it was the serverless functions in Dart. And then from there, people could use their Firebase authentication or use their Supabase authentication or whatever, but just have that really nice streamlined experience for deploying Dart functions.
Do you also have some docs in here about how people can already integrate with an existing authentication resource in the meantime? Or are you still working on this piece?
But we don't at the moment. That's something I need to do.
Okay, because that would be quite useful. How far along is progress on at least functions, right? It seems like it's usable, but does that mean it's production ready?
Yeah, so we have a handful of people that are already using Celeste Cloud. It's currently like in a private beta state, but I'm working very hard to get those customers into production. I think we can do that within the next week or two.
Now, I'm guessing that these functions, right, are basically, I don't know the name in Google and GCP, but they're AWS Lambda like kind of things, right?
Yeah, that's the idea. You can treat them as basically lambdas.
Now, why go for something that's AWS Lambda based versus, say, a VPC or something similar?
Well, just conceptually, something like a Lambda, like Firebase functions, Supabase edge functions. This is kind of the model that we see work really well, which is like this serverless mentality of the way you build backends. And we think that that makes it very composable. When you're writing functions, they're very purpose specific. They're like single responsibility. And then you just compose them into like workflows or, via some orchestration method. And so it's really just like the serverless mentality that we're trying to shoot for.
There is some apps out there, of course, that need some kind of cron job or thing to run on a schedule. Can these functions support something like that?
Yeah, it's on a roadmap. And that's the nice thing is like when it is just a singular function, it's pretty easy to conceptualize someone calling that function versus a cron scheduler calling that function in the same way. Right. And so, yeah, we think like that kind of plays into that composability model where eventually we'll have like kind of this event driven flow mentality, event driven architecture is another way it's called, just kind of built in to the platform.
So this looks pretty interesting. I've never really been sold on the functions as a service before, though, but seems like they're starting to pick up again in terms of people really advocating for them. So what I find is there's so many like background jobs and things I need to run that I just find it easier just to run everything in a single instance, throw it into a Docker container and run it up online. But I suppose for people
Yeah.
who are newer to this stuff, writing functions and having all that abstracted into this maybe makes a lot more sense. I mean, what's the target audience that you're trying to go for?
Yeah, certainly for beginners, I think that there's really no great advantage to learning all of this stuff up front. Docker, especially, it seems simple and then you dive into the weeds of it and it gets like very complicated very quick. And even like setting up a cron scheduler in a remote environment, I think it's a unnecessary burden for a beginner. And then even for like me, someone that is a bit more seasoned and has experience doing this stuff, I've built Celeste for me in part, right? Like I wanted this. I wanted something that I didn't have to write all of this infrastructure anymore. I didn't have to spin up these VMs or spin up these container services anymore. I could just write Dart and then run a single command and deploy it and not worry about it.
Yeah, that's definitely a beauty thing, right? Is that if you can run all this stuff by yourself, because it does get tedious. Like you said, you have to turn on all these services, make sure they're all running, the contracts involved between them, all these kinds of steps to make sure that you can have a nice system and things just work. It's really tricky. So having something just integrated works so much better, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And from what I've seen, a lot of enterprise, a lot of big companies end up building something like a platform as a service for themselves internally because they end up needing all of these different things. And so it seems like there's a lot of maybe not wasted effort out there, but a lot of duplicated effort into solving the same sorts of problems. And I think for Flutter developers, people building apps that is their passion, that is their love, maybe you just don't want to worry about this and shouldn't have to, I don't think.
Well, the other thing too is you mentioned companies, right? There's still a lot of companies that maybe will not or don't have everything on the cloud. And not
Yeah.
everybody would like to be on the cloud. And there's also been somewhat of a movement to get off the cloud. Well, what about that kind of situation where you want to have like a home server or something like that and you want to run this? Is this something possible or something on the roadmap?
It's something I've been talking to customers about. I don't have immediate plans to support like a self-hosting use case. Most importantly, because that would require like going down to Docker or really probably Kubernetes and like spinning out Kubernetes manifests for people. And it's not an experience I can stand by. So it's on my mind. Like I'm always thinking in the back of my mind how I can solve that problem. But I would want to treat it as like its own product, like a self-hosted solution that, had the same level of developer experience that the managed solution offered.
Now, I'm thinking instead of going the whole Kubernetes route, why not look at something like not Docker itself, but you have like a Docker file with all the different services in it?
Yeah, like a Docker Compose. It's a possibility. And maybe that is the best, that can be done is just, Docker something or other. I'd love to think that there was still yet a better way. But if we get far into this and that seems to be like the best way to support self-hosting, then we'll do that.
Yeah, I just feel like that's like a nice in-between solution because Kubernetes running that on a server by yourself as an absolute beginner, forget about it. It's really ridiculous. But Docker
Yeah.
Compose is definitely much easier, I would say, because most people are just going to have like a single server instance. They're not going to have multi-node set up with failovers and blue-green deployments and all this other stuff. But I think that if you're running that yourself, you should probably be able to create that using the Docker Compose because you can figure out which ones are which and how to split everything across yourself, I would think.
Yeah, I think ideally like something like that will be possible. It really is a separate product because I have to make sure that even just like the deployed experience in the cloud versus someone deploying it in their self-hosting environment is identical. That's kind of difficult, especially like when Google provides so many things out of the box. I have to think like, well, if someone's self-hosting, how do they replicate that for themselves?
I don't really look at the self-hosting part necessarily, but I try to use Kubernetes just because it's like in every single cloud provider. So, because I just have a single Docker container, so it's like, well, I can run that wherever I can run Docker. And if I'm using Kubernetes, okay, at least I know that if I go from GCP to AWS or whatever, I can kind of figure out how to do it because I'm not doing anything cloud specific. That's the tricky
Yeah,
part, the cloud vendorization, right? Has that been something that you're
exactly.
worried about?
Yeah, in the long term, absolutely. In the short term, it's a trade off I'm willing to make because my main priority is really just solving people's problems. And I think that's a good problem to have, but it's something we can tackle later.
So using the Lambdas, right, the functions as a service, what else are you planning to use or what else are you using besides just the one?
Well, in Google, we're using Cloud Run, which is like ECS in AWS, but it's just like a container orchestrator. Yeah, that's primarily what we're using right now. We use some various services like Key Manager for storing encryption keys, just like various services, load balancing, that kind of stuff. But the bulk of the platform is really just Cloud Run.
What about storing data? Because that's obviously eventually something that you need to do, right?
Yeah, we're looking into options right now. I think, whatever solution that we land on, it's going to be a SQL solution. We will have like an out of the box ORM provided as well. And then we really want to tackle offline first because I think that's a problem that weighs on people's minds that I haven't seen fully solved yet.
Do you know kind of which database you'd want to be looking at though?
Not quite. We're exploring a couple different options. So the main avenue we're exploring right now is SQLite everywhere. So kind of a distributed SQLite on the back end, and then you get a SQLite on the front end.
So you plan just to sync the databases so that way you have like a failover?
Yeah, you'd have a pretty standard distribution mechanism where you have multiple servers that coordinate to provide high availability and failover and that kind of stuff.
I did see that there is some services that you can easily sync things like to AWS in terms of the SQLite database. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, there's a couple different ways people have tried to tackle it. One is just like a backup mechanism where you're just like syncing a file from a client to the server. And that works really well if you just have like a single client and a single server. And then there's more like the Cloudflare R2 approach where you actually have like this coordinated SQLite database effort on the back end. And then you have like multiple servers actually coordinating around the same database.
This sounds a little bit like a master server, master slave kind of replication style, no?
Yeah, exactly. You'd have like a master that handles the writes and then like some read replicas.
I know that SQLite started to kind of make a little bit of a comeback in terms of being used because it's kind of been something where it's like, okay, well, small applications or small load, it's fine, but things get pretty heavy. Definitely don't use it. But it seems like people are still trying to find ways to use it. Do you feel that it's kind of like trying to fit square peg in a round hole, or is it actually a very capable solution?
From what I've seen, it's a very capable solution. I think the limits of SQLite are way above what most people would expect. A million writes per second is kind of the number that is in my head. So at that scale, like it's a good problem to have. I think that, and there's a lot of options. That's just like vanilla SQLite. So that's not even trying to get into the guts of it and figure things out. So at that point, I think, there's a lot of potential to even, improve on top of SQLite. So there's a company called Terso, which is trying to do that right now, actually.
A million writes per second, that's a lot for most people's applications.
Yeah, it's a lot.
It'd be tricky to not be able to handle.
Yeah.
You mentioned the roadmap quite a few times, right? You're only three and a half months in. What's kind of happening in the immediate roadmap with the next couple of months?
Primary focus is getting Celeste Cloud production ready, releasing it to the public so that anybody can try it out and sign into it. And then after that, like we're focusing on our authentication solution, which will include email magic link support, a social sign-in, like Google sign-in, and then passkeys. and then a policy ability so that you can, grant access for certain users to certain functions, give them ability to do certain things. Still all in Dart, that you're not like managing and fumbling with client IDs or any of this kind of stuff.
I like that you're looking at passkeys. That's attractive for me because it's
Okay.
so much better than typing in username, password, or whatever.
Yeah, we made it a hard requirement that Celeste auth will not support passwords.
Okay, that's nice. So you have the social logins, right? So then you still have to remember your password for those. Actually, I did meet so many people that don't know their Apple IDE password. And so I have no idea how they work with the Apple Store because, you do have to eventually enter that in, I think.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, like certainly Apple has kind of gone full on with passkeys as well. Like you can do Face ID for pretty much anything inside of the Apple ecosystem. Like I haven't entered a password for Apple in a while, but even like Google now is supporting passkeys. GitHub now supports passkeys. Like a lot of places are trying to get rid of passwords and just be done with them.
I'm really looking forward to that. It's been a blast just to log in with passkeys. It seems like all the major providers, they always sync them for you automatically, so you don't have to worry about anything. Like no matter which, if you're on your Android, if you're on your Windows, whatever, they just kind of sync up. But now the annoying thing I wish Apple can somehow fix is one consistent scenario I always find is like if I'm laying in bed and I want to open up a service, it scans my face and it never seems to work the first couple of times. So I have to like sit up in bed and then hold the phone up.
Oh yeah.
That's the
Yeah, I
annoying thing.
bumped
Is
into
just getting
that.
the perfect face scan in all situations. It's very difficult.
Yeah, it was nice when they still had Touch ID as well because you could just fall back to that, but now it's kind of a pain in the butt.
I wish they would bring back Touch ID. Face ID is nice when it works, but when it doesn't work, it's painful. But like you said,
Yep.
Touch ID work all the time, no matter what you're doing. You just tap your thumb and you're done.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. So after authentication, I mean, you do have a couple other things that you're looking at. You do say the word data here, right?
Yeah.
If I look over here, define your data schemas. When is that going to come into the picture? Because data and functions are very much kind of siblings, right? You need both to a certain extent. You can't just keep running functions and not storing them somewhere. Obviously, you probably have some kind of workaround for that thing with authentication. So when is data going to come into the picture?
Yeah, so data will come after auth. The reason for that is that data in functions is already kind of an issue because your data needs to be close to your functions for your functions to be performant. If your database is in like Chicago, Illinois, but then your function is running in like Asia, then your function has to make a call all the way back to Chicago and then all the way back to Illinois. You may as well just put the function in Illinois next to the database, right? Because you still have to make that round trip regardless. So the only way that accessing databases in functions makes sense to me is if like the data is close. I think like Supabase actually recently released their read replica support. So you could bring your copy of your data close to your functions where they'd be reading it. And Supabase already has like a Dart client. So you could use that today in Celeste functions because they have just that Dart client and you can run any, Dart code in your backend there.
Okay, maybe I missed something over here, right? So with the functions as a service, you're saying that usually those would spin up to an instance closer to the user. So then when you have the database, that's why you have this kind of issue about where your master or your write replica is, right?
Yeah, and that's kind of the idea, right? Is that you want your compute to run close to the user. You're going to have lower latency and you're going to have like, quicker response times when that's the case. But a lot of people don't do that. And specifically because those functions are accessing a database that's halfway around the world anyway. So there's really no point in spending the extra dough to bring the function closer to the user if it's just going to have to talk to the database anyway. So a lot of times people actually don't do this, right? They just have their functions close to the database in a single region and just call it a day because there's really no point in trying to create quote unquote edge functions where they're very close to your user.
Yeah, I didn't even think about that because I usually do the latter. I know that Fly.io, if you ever heard of Fly.io before?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, so you can easily spin up more, these replicas of your app all over the world. And then they have a special library for Elixir where it'll actually find automatically the right replica for you and write to that one. Otherwise, it reads the closest one to you, which is interesting. So they handle that basically for you out of the box.
Yeah, a solution like that is kind of, what I would love to see in Celeste, where it's just out of the box. You're not thinking about it because as soon as you do, there's just a lot of obstacles and challenges to worry about. And that's why we scheduled data to follow functions and auth so that there's a good foundation that we can build on to support something like that.
This is a lot of work that you're putting into this. And I'm happy that you're tackling each piece one by one and go into the next one. Obviously, you're going to have to still go back and, make some small changes to make sure that they work together, though. But how long do you think you're going to have until you finish all the different sections?
Yeah, and I mean, on your second point, it's a big reason why I wanted to start from scratch with this is because when everything's fully integrated, it's a lot easier to do it this way, where you're building the foundation slowly over time, because you can think 10 steps ahead and think, well, how's data going to work with functions if I make this change in the functions API right now? And so a lot of that stuff we can kind of sidestep early on, which makes it nice, makes it easier to move quicker too, because we're not dealing with a lot of like legacy craft. We can just build it so that it's seamlessly integrated from the start. In terms of functionality, yeah, between like functions, auth, and data, I would love to be done within at least have like a first version that is production ready, conservatively like 6 months from now.
Okay. Conservatively, that means that you have a pretty good chance of making that. 'Cause that's a lot of work. I mean, are you really sure you can make it within that time frame?
Yeah, I mean, that's just gauging based off the pace I've been able to move at so far. There's been a lot of carryover from my lessons learned at Amplify at AWS. And, I've got some help on the way. So it's not going to be just me for long.
Are you also looking at other Dart solutions on the back end too, like ServerPod and so many other things?
Yeah, I've played around with everything that's out there so far. I think for me, it's just a unique perspective on the situation coming from AWS, coming from that side of things. I've seen a lot of how the sausage is made, if you will. And so I just have, a lot of opinions around how to do things, basically.
Now, have you found any other solutions that are similar to yours, or you think that everybody has their own kind of style or flavor?
Yeah, well, I think so. As soon as we have like auth, I think we'll be fairly unique in the fact that, we're a fully managed solution, right? So there's no currently like fully managed Dart on the back end solution that will include like functions and auth. And that's why we're not focusing on self-hosting, is because it's just so nice to be able to run, like Celeste deploy and then just not worry about it. It's just done. It's out of your hands. It's our problem from there on. So I think we'll be fairly unique when we get to that place.
The other thing I think about too is that it seems like a lot of people, they are looking at the cost. I just remember seeing so many times online, like, how can I get my Firebase bill lower because it's too high? I know
Yeah.
it's quite generous with uploading data, but when you do go to the cloud, you are paying something, right? And so, like, what's the typical amount of money people need to prepare in advance for every month for their app, or that's really difficult to say?
It's pretty difficult to say just because, like, if you looked at the distribution of Firebase bills, there would be a pretty wide distribution. So it's pretty difficult to say. And I haven't really finalized my thoughts on pricing. But if there's one thing I want to accomplish with Celeste pricing, it's just that it's like very easy to reason about. I think, as soon as you have to open up a spreadsheet to calculate what your monthly cost is going to be, in my mind, that's not ideal. And I think Firebase does a pretty decent job from what I understand. But I remember at AWS, you literally had to pull out a giant spreadsheet to figure out what you're going to pay every month. And it was just a lot of work. So I think like having transparent pricing that is very easy to reason about and very easy to plan around is one of my goals.
Do you think for hobby projects it would be like a couple of US dollars a month or something? Just trying to get an idea about what people should be expecting if they're going to be using Celeste just for their own, like, playing around, this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think, our standard tier will probably be more around like $20 a month.
Celeste only, you're saying like the whole infrastructure on GCP, etc.
That would include, yeah, like deployments to GCP.
And Celeste is planning to charge a fee in the future, or do you know your revenue strategy?
That's the whole thing. Like you just pay $20 a month. That would give you like everything.
Okay, because I thought that Celeste would be talking to your existing infrastructure.
No, no, no. So you don't need your own Google Cloud account.
So actually, it's totally even abstracted from that. Like, you don't even need to care about the infrastructure in the background. You're handling
Yeah,
everything. You just pay a
literally
simple
everything.
monthly cost. Okay,
Yeah.
that makes sense now. I thought that you would be running on your own infrastructure.
For enterprises, we've heard that that's an interesting use case because they have like health data or financial data that they need secured in a special way. And so, in those cases, we may look to do that, but it's going to be a very manual thing. And I think for most users, we're just going to offer the ability to deploy into our cloud account. And then, you don't even need to have a Google Cloud account. You don't even need to know it exists. Like, it doesn't matter.
That's good to have, but still the issue of like segregation of data and how you can do that in a reliable way where things don't leak through is a question that I think a lot of people will have, right? Because maybe you're not storing health
Yeah.
data or financial data, or maybe you are, but you need to be careful about, this things leak out, or you may be storing a private journal, right? And you may be saying some things that you want people to know. So how are you planning to keep data integrity and keep things separated so that I feel safe that even you have my stuff?
Yeah, I mean, a couple different ways. It's just kind of built into my blood. Like at AWS, they always reinforce that security is priority zero. We would do regular pen testing and, appointments with the security team at AWS. For Celeste, we'll be doing pen tests. We're going to be pursuing what's called SOC 2 compliance, which is a fairly industry standard way of conforming to a lot of these security considerations. And I would say that, like, the premise of security being priority zero has really carried through and kind of stuck with me. And I think that every line of code I write, I'm thinking about that. But we'll tackle it in such a way that it's, transparent, auditable, and that people feel secure.
Does that mean that I don't need to worry that there's somebody digging through my data because you have all access to everything? As the Celeste team who's running the whole thing that's on their account, they technically would have access to all the data if I'm storing my data with you.
All the data will be encrypted at rest, right? Using keys that are not under our control. So you will have encryption keys that only you can access, basically.
Okay. It's good to hear because whenever something's totally on somebody else's side, there's always lots of questions about, wait, what does that mean? So is there going to be some kind of term that says, like, in the end, the data is owned, the code is owned by the person who's paying the bill? You're just helping to run the infrastructure. These kinds of terms, I suppose, are going to be very clear, right?
Yeah, definitely. It'll be clear.
Now, what kind of license are you looking to have for the Celeste software itself? Is it going to be open source? If it's open source, which license are you looking at using?
The bits that we have open source right now are MIT licensed. And if and when we release more source code, it will be MIT licensed. The majority is closed source right now. And the reason that I wanted to do that was to make sure that when I do open source it, like, I can stand by that. What I didn't want to happen was to make it open source and then turn around in 5 years and say, actually, now it's business licensed or whatever HashiCorp and others have done recently. I really believe in the model of open source, and certainly, like, even if not all of our code is open source, I really want to involve the community in our process. So we have, like, regular RFCs that we put out to get people's feedback. We have GitHub issues open. We have a Discord channel. So we take pull requests and all that. I think in time, you'll see a lot more being open source, but right now the majority is still closed source.
You mentioned a couple of different licensing models, right? There's the one where MongoDB has taken, which I think a lot of people are also taking, that do these kind of services that are kind of open, where it's like, okay, it's open source, but I forgot what you call it. I think you already know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, it's like a business source license. It's basically like a source available license. It's like we're letting you look at the source code, but you can't do anything with it.
So you said you're totally going to avoid that one.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really yucky way to do things. Well, at least in their cases, because they had a more permissive license to start and then they changed their minds later when they went and built their cloud offering and then made it the BSL license. That's primarily what I wanted to avoid. I feel like that just gives a really bad taste in people's mouths. And the source code that we have available now will and forever always be open source. And any source code that we release in the future, we will stand by that.
And you don't have any concerns that companies that will take your open source and then reuse it as their own, you have no concerns about that, or you don't mind?
For the source code that we release, the goal is to create a community and drive innovation around that, right? So it's safe to say that if we put any source code out there, we want people to pull it down, explore, play with it, and then, like, make copies of it, do whatever they want.
Okay, that's good to hear. I'm looking forward to seeing the output of Celeste and see how it takes a hold. I like that we have more solutions out there. Is there anything that I missed that you wanted to let us know about, Celeste, or what you're working on, or the timeline, or anything like that?
Yeah, I would just say, stay tuned. Follow us on Twitter, Celeste_dev. That's where we post all of our updates. You can also go to celeste.dev and join our waitlist. And we'll send out regular emails to that will have our latest updates. But yeah, the goal is within the next month or less to have, like, a self-serve option where people can just go to the website, click join, and you'll be off and running. So just stay tuned for that. We're really excited for everything that's coming.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm looking forward to this. It's great having you on. I'd love to hear more about what's going on with Celeste. It's good to have more options, like I said, but I'm worried about having too many options and people have no idea which one to choose. So it's good if we can start to try to niche out, in this case, this one, in that case, that one, then at least people will not be so overwhelmed. We already have too many packages on pub.dev. So having too many solutions for hosting our apps could be a similar issue.
Let's hope this doesn't turn into another state management situation.
Oh, yeah, that's another one too. I had that another day. I actually just heard somebody using MobX, which I don't hear a lot of these days. So that's interesting.
Yeah, but I'm excited. I think competition is good. Innovation is good, and yeah, people will have choices, which is good. But yeah, we'll see what happens. I'm excited.
Yeah, I'm excited to see what this is going on. And I wish you good luck, because doing this on your own, or with a couple of people even, is really not simple. So I hope to see this in the future and hear people using it and having a great time.
I appreciate it. Yeah, I'm having fun so far, so no worries.
If you're not having fun, then you're probably won't last very long. But yeah,
Yeah, totally.
spite business, it sounds like, if you're doing it and not having fun.
Yeah, no, that's not good.
All right. Thank you, Dylan, for coming on. Hopefully I have you again in the future.
All right. Yeah. Take care.